It's a pleasure and honor to follow Professor Sracic, and I agree with the analysis he's presenting. Just to follow on your answer about the jobs in Ohio, my wife Deb, who's up here in the front row, and I have lived for a long time in China. And I've been studying a lot of manufacturing issues in China. China has the same problem as Youngstown, as Mexico, as Europe, as Ireland, I assume, of manufacturing rebounding. Manufacturing jobs are just not coming back anyplace. And just as a parallel point, the coal industry. I love the statistic of the U.S. coal industry. The peak output year for U.S. coal, I think, is within just the last couple of years. But the peak employment year, does anybody know the peak employment year for U.S. coal industry? 1918. Since 1918, it's gone down every decade. And so the U.S. is producing more coal almost than ever before with 1/10 as many workers as it did 100 years ago. And I think it's sort of parable for the manufacturing promise. So you've heard a renowned academic and student of political science and writer for The Atlantic and elsewhere talk about this perspective on Ohio. I'm going to give you the sort of reportorial complement to that. The reason I love being a reporter, and the main thing I feel is my value added in writing for The Atlantic, as I've done for a long time, is to tell the things you didn't know before you showed up. Things that are surprising when you get to some place. And there are several, I guess, three main categories of those things that might not be evident about the U.S. election, at least as I understand it, even for a group as well informed as all of you are about U.S. politics. I know everybody here has been there a million times and has studied up, but there are several things I think are underappreciated, I would argue, and these are complementary rather than in any way different from what Professor Sracic was saying. Number one is the contrast between the consequences of this election and the conditions in which it happened. By which I mean the following. If you look back on the 2000 presidential election, you know the Bush v. Gore election, that if any of 1,000 things had gone another way, Al Gore would have ended up in the White House, not George W. Bush. The history of Iraq would have been different. The history of any number of the Supreme Court would have been different if Ralph Nader had not campaigned in Florida, if the ballots had been different in Palm Beach County, if. And I think we are in a very similar situation with the 2016 election, where I can tell you firsthand that as of 9 p.m. election evening, no one on Donald Trump's campaign thought he was going to win. Really, nobody thought he was going to win. There were all these sort of straws in the wind of, we were in Deb's hometown on Lake Erie in Ohio the weekend before the election. There were lots of Trump signs and everything, but every plausible indicator was that yes, this was going to make it closer than it should have been, et cetera, et cetera. And so while we know there are going to be great consequences of having a man like Donald Trump, with his temperament, with his values, with the kinds of people he's appointing, having him in control for as long as he's going to be in control, and all the things he is doing and undoing, and et cetera, et cetera. I think that it is there's a temptation to look back on this as sort of a fated, inevitable thing on the scale, say, of the 1984 election between Ronald Reagan and Walter Mondale, where there was no chance Walter Mondale was ever going to win that election, or like the Dukakis George H.W. Bush election in 1988, where there was just very clear, large elections where it was always going to go that way. In this case, we have enormous consequences coming from the famous butterfly flapping its wings and bringing on nuclear winter or whatever. And I think it's worth also focusing on the exceptional role of the Electoral College this time. I am not a man in his first youth, but until 17 years ago, I had always thought that an Electoral College popular vote split was an entirely hypothetical possibility, because the last time it happened was 1888. Something where you thought, well, the Electoral College is there as some kind of nicety, but in the real world, always the winner of the popular vote would win the presidency. So the George W. Bush election of 2000 was educational in that way. If I think 70,000 votes in your state of Ohio had gone the other way in 2004, we would have had John Kerry doing the reverse of losing the popular vote and winning the Electoral College. That would have been significant in many ways, including possibly leading to the end of the Electoral College, because then you would have had back-to-back the Democrats being the losers from the Electoral College split, the Republicans being the losers, but obviously that didn't happen. And so, again, this is from the leverage of this election, I think should not be confused with thinking it was a huge voice of the people being expressed. It was something very conditional with large consequences, which leads to my second divergent point, which is, I think, the ways in which this is being interpreted in retrospect exaggerate the way the outcome reflects the actual mood of the country. Here is what I mean, including the fact that 3 million votes went for a surplus for Hillary Clinton. Deb and I, over the last 4 years, have spent most of our time in the U.S. flying around the country, the interior America, in a little propeller airplane, which we've had and flown for a long time, going to the kinds of cities that went for Trump. Dodge City, Kansas, Duluth up in Minnesota, Greenville, South Carolina, Fresno, California, Central Oregon. You name your dislocated part of the American topography. We've been to these places. And what has been so striking is the divergence between a very sour, polarized, hostile mood when it comes to national politics and a very different mood on almost everything else. I'll just give you a couple illustrations. One is economic revival in general. The U.S., like Ireland, like China, like every place on Earth, has been first shocked by the crises of the last 9 years financially, and then by the long-term dislocation of globalization that's had its impacts every single place on Earth. What's striking is, even in the places that are most affected by this, we weren't in Youngstown, but we were in Erie, Pennsylvania at some length, and in Allentown, PA, and other parts of that same sweep. And you have, yes, there is the dislocation of the last 50 years and the last 20 years, but in the last 10 years, many of these places you have younger people, you have immigrants, you have refugees, you have startups, people feeling as if, yes, things have been difficult, but they're coming back. I understand that Youngstown, does Youngstown have a sort of comeback sense in Youngstown itself?
Somewhat in the downtown.
Yeah.
There is some downtown revitalization, but not overall.
So I would argue that, I would tell you repertorially, most places we've been, the mood is a twist on the old joke that people hate the Congress and love their congressman. The twist on the joke is people think the U.S. is in terrible trouble, but the part of the U.S. that is within their own immediate experience, they think is moving in the right direction as opposed to falling backwards. I was at the Republican convention in Cleveland a little more than a year ago, and there was a famous headline in the Wall Street Journal at the end of the convention, which was, GOP delegates say economy is terrible, except where they're from. And it was a sense of a sort of dystopian split between the idea of how things are every place else and how they are where you are from. And so every problem we're aware of in this second Gilded Age, is real, but many places we had a sense of movement. A second thing which is quite striking is, I would argue that the nativist rhetoric you would associate with Trump himself and some of his allies is fomenting divisions in the U.S. rather than channeling or expressing them. What I mean is, for example, in the Central Plains, in Kansas, what you would think of as a sort of traditionally Anglo part of the country, it's now very significantly Latino, and I think opinion polls support what we saw repertorially, which is, and something similar in the Brexit vote too, which is the more immigrants and refugees were actually present, the less acute fear people had. And the most lusty build-a-wall rallies were in New Hampshire and places like that. They weren't in Arizona, they weren't in my homeland of Southern California, et cetera, et cetera. And so people from Ireland would understand that the history of the U.S. with immigration has been long and never trouble-free, but ultimately has worked towards assimilation. When Irish people came, they had their challenges in the urban Northeast, and Germans, and Italians, and Poles, and Vietnamese, and every other group has had both disruptive effects, but then has ultimately been absorbed. And that process seems still to be going on in much of the country. And so I think that there is a minority view that we're hearing expressed and magnified at the national level, which I would distinguish from sort of mainstream welling up opinion. One other way in which, just in the same category of a local versus national divergence, is in national politics. I think no matter what your affiliation in the U.S., you feel somewhat discouraged right now Democrats obviously are discouraged. There's a split among the Republicans because neither part of the Republican coalition feels that it's getting its way. But in much of the country, at the local and often the state level, there's a sense of governance working and people being able to invest in new community colleges or new environmental projects, or et cetera, et cetera. So just to wrap this up, my second things you didn't know till you showed up point was a almost historically acute split between national level temperament and effect and local level effectiveness and temperament. The third thing I'd say, just as a reporter from traveling around, this is also affected by the past few days in Paris, where the Atlantic was putting on its City Lab conference, is the sense of a city-led and specifically mayor-led kind of renaissance of doing things, whether it's the fact that after the current administration announced its withdrawal from the Paris agreements, you had the mayors of almost every major American city saying, well, we're still in. And the governors of states representing most of the population saying that we're still in, and major companies doing that around the country. And you just, there's a kind of empowered sense of mayors as, this is a time where the responsibility is on us. We control much of the way that people actually live, their school systems, and Deb can close her ears at this point because she's heard this from me 1,000 times, but you all, this may be the first time, so I will ask her to put up with it. When I was in college, I studied American history, and I now obsessively read the history of the sort of 1880s through 1910, the Gilded Age through progressive populist reform era, because I think we are recapitulating much of that now. The dislocations, the dissatisfactions are all very similar. Migration, dysfunctional national politics, people losing their traditional livelihoods, all the things that we, new tech fortunes, changes in the media, et cetera, those are very similar. And there was a very impressive 30 or 40 year period then, coinciding with, obviously, with changes in Ireland, of locally led reform efforts in the environment, in governance, in women's rights, in racial rights, and all the rest. And I think we are seeing some of the seeds of that in the U.S. now, sort of a locally led reform level. So my complimentary message is that in addition to the sort of large-scale issues in conservatism that Professor Sracic was saying, I think we do have some of these local national tensions which may, or divergences, which may be the seeds of the next kind of reform movement.